Okay, everyone, I think we are going to start. So welcome back to our webinar series with Cashmerette. We had a little bit of a break last week, but we're back on full force today. So today we are going to be talking about fabric, which, you know, I guess it goes without saying that unless you figure out the right fabric, you're probably not going to, end up with great garments. They can really make or break it. And I think that when you have just begun to sew, or you're just beginning to do slightly more advanced techniques, it can be very confusing, right? Because especially when you're like learning on the internet and you don't necessarily have it in your hands, it can be a little bit confusing. So today we're having a slight change of pace, which is that Carrie is going to be leading this Zoom because she is our resident fabric expert and fanatic. So I'm going to be handing over to her. It's going to run in the same way as usual. If you want to ask questions, you can type them into the chat. And if you want to actually, ask your question live, you can do that too. You just need to like tell us in the chat that you want to do that. And I will basically be keeping an eye on all the questions and be throwing them over to Carrie occasionally. This webinar is also recorded and it's going to go up on YouTube, and we're also going to send an email to everyone at the end with the slides and the links to all of our past webinars if you want to catch up on them. So hopefully that makes sense, and with that I'm going to hand over to Carrie. Over to you.
All right. Hi everyone. I'm usually the quiet one on the back end recording all of the questions, so it's nice to talk to you all today. So we're going to talk through fabrics, and we're going to start with some pretty basic stuff, but feel free to ask questions like Jenny said in the chat, and I will pause periodically throughout. I love fabric. I love selecting fabrics. I do most of the selection of fabrics for our photo shoots, which is one of my favorite parts of my job. So I'm a big fabric fan. I'm sure we all have nice sizable stashes and everything, but today we're going to talk through some of the basics and also how to pick your fabrics, what to look for, things like that. So let me share my screen. Sorry, hold on. Always a little bit of technical issues at first, of course. Here we go. So we're going to start by talking about the two main types of fabrics that you're going to be thinking about when you are planning a project. So we basically use knits and wovens when we're garment sewing. There's also non-woven fabric, which is essentially like extruded into the shape of the fabric, which we don't typically use when we are garment sewing. Let's see if this will work. Okay. Can you see that? Okay, great. All right, so knits and wovens. What's the basic difference between the two? Basically, knits have loops of fabric, loops of thread that go like this, and they're looped together. And because of that, they can stretch really easily because of the actual structure of the fabric. And wovens have a warp and a weft, so they go like this. So unless the actual fibers that you're using have stretch, the woven has less stretch than the knit because of the construction of it. Now, whether you're using a woven or a knit is going to depend primarily on the pattern. So one of the questions that we get asked the most is, can I use a knit for a woven pattern or a woven for a knit pattern? And the short answer is no. The long answer is it depends, and you might not like the fit of it because fundamentally the patterns are designed differently for different types of fabric. So knit patterns, especially Cashmerette patterns, we really rely on the stretch. So we have negative ease in parts of the garment, which means the garment is smaller than you and stretches to fit. So you can imagine if you have negative ease, so the garment is smaller than you, and then you try to make it in a woven fabric that doesn't stretch, or even if it has some stretch in the woven, it doesn't stretch the same way a knit fabric would stretch, then you're gonna be basically in a binder, right? You're gonna be totally tight in this garment. So So there are some patterns that you can get away with it, like our cedar dolman top, for example. We originally designed it for knits, but it doesn't have negative ease because it's a dolman top, it's a little boxier. And we found that it works just as well in a lightweight woven. So that's sort of the exception. But for the most part, a lot of our patterns, you're not gonna be really happy with if you try to make a knit pattern in a woven or vice versa. But again, that being said, we all are our own independent people. If you really want to try something, you can. But the general guidance is look to the fabric requirements on a pattern to make your initial decision between a knit and a woven, because they behave fundamentally very differently. Now, the other part is the fibers that the fabric is made out of. Now, knits and wovens can be made out of the same stuff. It's not like all cottons are wovens or all polys are knits or anything like that. So the actual fiber that's used to construct the fabric can be different. So there's basically 3 categories of fibers that we primarily use in garment sewing: natural fibers, regenerated fibers, and synthetic fibers. So natural fibers are cottons, are silks, linen. They're actual plant fibers, or silk is not a plant fiber, but it's a natural fiber that are directly used. So like the actual cotton is made into thread. You don't have to do anything else to it. Regenerated fibers are pretty interesting. So they actually take natural products. So usually it's cellulose, so it's a plant-based, but they break all that down into the cellulose itself. So they take bamboo, or they take wood pulp or eucalyptus, and they break it down into the actual cellulose, and then they extrude the cellulose into threads. So they take it's different from the natural fiber because it's not just the product turned into thread, it's the product broken down and then returned into thread. So that's kind of the difference between those two. It's a little bit tricky because technically it is a natural fiber, right? It's made from stuff in nature, but it has to be processed another level. So those are things like rayon, tencel, lyocell, modal, even acetate is a regenerated fiber. And then there's synthetics. So synthetics are things like polyester, spandex, acrylic. Those are made usually from plastic, basically. And there are recycled ones, which is cool, where they take plastic bottles and they turn it into polyester fabric. But that's basically the 3 main categories of fiber. Jenny, do we have any questions so far? Okay, cool. All right, so some basic vocabulary. It's kind of like learning a whole new language when you learn how to sew. I learned how to sew about 8 years ago and learned from YouTube primarily. So I remember learning these words and being like, what on earth is that? Okay, we'll figure that out, and learning the importance of some of these, especially grain line. I feel like if that's the only thing you learn about fabric is grain line, that's the most important. So grain line is, in woven, it's pretty easy. Like you've got your cross grain, which is your warp threads. They go horizontally. And you have your grain, which is your weft threads that go vertically, right? Now, when you have a nice even grain like that, your fabric is gonna hang straight. None of the threads are going sideways. So that's on grain. Bias is when you cut at a 45-degree angle to the grain. And the nice thing about that is oftentimes you'll see like necklines bound in bias, and that makes it drape a lot more. So I have some rayon right here, and you can see that straight up and down, this is like on grain, right? It's got a little bit of what's called mechanical stretch, which is where you can pull on the fabric, but it's not like a stretchy fabric. And same with vertically. But if I were to hold this at a 45-degree angle, you get a lot more mechanical stretch than you would at the horizontal or vertical. So that allows you to get things that curve nicely, even when you're not using a stretch fabric. So that's a great technique to use, is cutting things on the bias. But if you accidentally cut things on the bias, you're gonna find things warp out of shape really easily. It's also important when you're doing things like cutting necklines, especially if they have a long bias, so like a lot of a deep V-neck or like a big open neckline. What you want to do when you cut that out is immediately, especially if you're using a really shifty fabric, immediately stay stitch, which is a small stitch length, not a long stitch length. I remember when I first started sewing, I was like, oh, it's like a basting stitch. You do a long stitch length, but you actually want a really short stitch length along the edge of that piece. And that'll keep the fabric from shifting out of shape too much. So that's a little technique if you get stuff that's cut on the bias. So the selvage of fabric is basically the edge where it's made. So you can see on this fabric, it's got sort of a fluffy selvage edge, and it's very obvious it's striped versus the rest of the fabric. But sometimes selvages are hard to find, especially on knit fabrics. Like if you get a chunk of yardage of knit, sometimes it'll come and you'll be like, wait, where's the selvage? I don't know, all the edges look the same. So what you want to look for is sort of like, there's usually little tiny thread holes where the fabric was on the mill. And so that can help you find it. Also, sometimes it rolls on knits. So you have like a little rolly edge and that will be your selvage. But the selvage is important to be able to find because it helps you find that cross grain versus the vertical grain. So depending on the type of fabric you're using, the behavior of the fabric might be different on the vertical grain versus the cross grain. So for example, on a knit, let's see, this one has some vertical stretch and it has a ton of horizontal stretch, right? So you can see if I cut this on the wrong grain, like if I cut it on the cross grain instead of on the vertical grain, I would end up with a much less stretchy fabric. So that's why you want to know where your selvage is. Stretch percentage kind of goes off of what I was just talking about, right? So stretch percentage is the percentage of extra distance you can get out of your fabric, basically, right? So if you have 2 inches of fabric and it's got 50% stretch, it'll stretch to 4 inches, no problem. Now, you want to test it kind of in the middle of your fabric, because if you're doing it on the very edge, sometimes it's sort of artificially stretching because it's just pulling apart the fibers that have been cut. So if you take your fabric in the center of it, you can stretch it and you'll see the stretch really easily. And then going along with stretch percentage is recovery. So it's great if your fabric stretches enough, but if it doesn't have good recovery, which means it springs back into shape, it's not going to look as good in your garment if you're relying a lot on that stretch. So like if you made the Concord t-shirt and you made it in something that had the right amount of stretch, so it had that 25, I think, is the percentage of stretch we need in the Concord. So if it has that 25% stretch, but then it stays stretched out, right? If it has no recovery, then that's not going to be good because it's just going to look stretched out all the time. You take it off and it's stretched out. Sometimes it'll spring back into shape when you wash it, but not always. So it's always a good thing to check when you're working with knits, especially, or stretch wovens, is the stretch and then the recovery. You can see that you can't really tell where I've stretched this fabric. Stretch, stretch, stretch. You can't really see it. But sometimes if you have a knit that doesn't have great recovery, you'll still be able to see sort of the bumps where you pulled. And you're going to see that in the garment when you wear it. So basically how the fabric behaves when it's not a garment is going to indicate a lot of how it's going to behave when it is a garment. The other things to think about is the drape of the fabric. So let's come back to these wovens that I've got here. So this is rayon. You can see it's a really nice drapey fabric. You know, it doesn't have a lot of structure. You can imagine, well, I'm wearing rayon right now. It's like just kind of easy, flowy. But if you wanted to make something like a structured button-up shirt or something, you wouldn't want to use this. You might want to use something more like this. Like this is a chambray that I've got here. And actually this one's cool because you can really see the weave of the fabric because the warp and weft threads are different colors. So instead of this,
Carrie, if you stop screen sharing, we'll be able to see it more easily.
Oh, sorry, yeah, good idea. Aha, thank you. So you can see here there is a pink warp thread and a white weft thread. And instead of actually having like a fabric that's dyed, over dyed, this is a woven color. So you can see that this is much more structured. it's got like a crisp drape, I would say. It still drapes some, but nothing like the rayon that just sort of like waterfalls out of your hand. So that's something to think about with wovens, but also with knits as well, because knits can be very different in their drape. This is a bamboo rayon blend, I believe. And it's got little nubblies you can see. So this is the one I was trying before with the stretch percentage, if you couldn't see that. And this is a very, very drapey fabric. It's pretty thin, it's pretty sheer. You'd want to be careful about what you were making with this. If you made a dress out of it, you might need a slip. But then there's something like a Ponte, which is much more structured. And it still has a nice drape. It's kind of like the difference between the rayon and the chambray. They're still drapey, but it's got more beef to it. It's a little more structured. It's a little thicker actual construction fabric. So drape is important to think about as well. Let's see. And then the last thing on that is hand. So a fabric's hand is basically how it feels, right? A fabric can have a cool hand. So things with cool hands are things often like a spandex. This is a swim spandex. Or silk has a cool hand. Rayon often has a cool hand as well. It's just like if you touch the fabric, does it feel cool or warm? So this Ponte has a warm hand. It feels warm against my skin versus this swim fabric that feels very cool against my skin. And that's something to think about. Just like when you find sort of the category of fabric that you need, what do you like? Like what feels good on your body? Because if you love what the fabric looks like and drapes like, but you hate the hand, you hate how it feels, you're not gonna wanna wear it. The whole point of sewing is we get to make things that we actually want to wear. So with that, I've got a little poll for you. So first, do you prefer sewing, knits, or wovens? So I remember when I first started sewing, I didn't know that knits were supposed to be scary. Like I remember with just sewing with them and being like, oh, this is fine, whatever. And then people being like, oh my gosh, you sewed knits already? I'm like, yeah, I didn't know I was supposed to be scared, which I think was a good thing actually, because I could just dive in and it would be fine. But I don't know, I mean, now I kind of, about half my sewing is knits and half is wovens. And it looks like we've got a little bit higher preference for woven sewing. It can be a little more forgiving depending on what your tools are. Once I got a walking foot, sewing knits became a whole lot easier. That's definitely a tip I would say is like if you're going to buy one thing for your sewing machine, a walking foot is great, both for knits and for finicky wovens. Most of the wovens I like to wear are rayons and drapey things, so walking foot is definitely helpful.
So we've got a few questions, Carrie.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's perfect.
The first question from Nadine is about washing your fabric. So she's asking, when fabric relaxes or shrinks in the wash, does it normally shrink more in the length as opposed to the width? Or is there no rule and you should always pre-wash a bit of fabric to test it?
That's a great question. I'm going to talk a little bit more about washing and treating later, but in general, from what my experience is, mostly it shrinks in length, but I would say it really depends on the fabric itself. So I always wash a little swatch of my fabric if I'm not sure how it's going to behave in the wash, and just see what I end up with. But yeah, it's definitely very important to figure out how your fabric is going to behave in the wash. Yeah.
Lynn wants to know if you have any guidance in terms of fabric weights. So when people say things like bottom weight, what does that mean?
Yeah, that is one of those things that it's so tricky because there's different ways of describing fabrics, right? So we can talk about the grams per square meter or ounces per square yard. Sometimes that's used, especially when you're fabric shopping online. Like if you're fabric shopping in person, it's a lot easier, but I'm going to talk a little bit later too about tips for fabric shopping online. But yeah, generally speaking, bottom weights are going to be thicker fabrics that have either a stiffer drape or they're less drapey oftentimes. And you would want to use those for things like skirts, pants, structured dresses, maybe like a structured jacket, versus like sometimes they're called shirting weight or medium weight fabrics, which is kind of like this chambray that I've got here, where it's got more of a crisp drape, but it's not super structured. And that's a really versatile fabric. You can use that for dresses, pants, shirts. Everything will be a little bit more structured, but you can use it for a wide variety of things. And then lightweight, I feel like sometimes the midweight is called dress weight as well, which sometimes we'll be speaking to the opacity, like how see-through it is. Sometimes fabric stores will tell you both the weight and the opacity, which is very helpful because you can have a lightweight fabric that's totally opaque, right? So like this swim fabric is very, very light, but you can't see through it at all. Whereas this rayon is very light, but you can see through it some. And then the knit is very light and you can see through it a lot, right? So the opacity sometimes tied to the weight and sometimes not. Yeah, does that answer the question? I feel like I kind of rambled there.
Also, with a lot of online retailers now, like the good ones, they often have a description of like what they recommend for it. So for instance, like Blackbird fabrics will say like suitable for like flowy culottes or suitable for like t-shirts, and they'll actually give you examples of the patterns that they recommend. Like Emma One Sock does the same. Yeah. One thing, you may mention this later, but like mood.com is like famously tends to say like they're lighter than they say they are. Like that's one thing you have to watch out with. But yeah, I think sometimes that can really help.
Totally. Yeah, and I will talk about that a little bit later too.
And then just a few people, it's not really a question, but just a comment. A few people mentioned the FAF IDT system.
Yes.
Basically works in a well, it doesn't work. It does the same thing as a walking foot, and various people are singing the praises in the chat.
Yes, I really love that too. I don't have a FAF. I have a Janome, just a pretty basic sewing machine that I love dearly. And I got like a $30 walking foot on Amazon pretty shortly after I bought the sewing machine, and it is amazing. But yeah, so if you have a basic sewing machine, buying a walking foot can be a great investment. But yeah, if you're lucky enough to have a built-in differential feed or IDT foot, that's really nice. So we got one more poll, and this is whether you prefer wearing knits or wovens. I always think this is an interesting, I can see it already happening, right? Like when we were looking at what people like to sew, it was mostly wovens, not hugely mostly wovens, but a lot of us go for knits when we're getting dressed. I mean, especially in quarantine, let's be honest. I have woven pants on today for the first time in a long time. So it's important to think about not just what you like to sew, but also what you like to wear when you're buying your fabric. When I first started sewing, I just would buy whatever I thought was cute, right? Like, oh, look at that cute color or that cute print, or I like the way that one feels. And I ended up with a stash that was just completely different from what I would actually want to wear, you know, which is sometimes fun. Sometimes I like to buy things like that have oranges on them and make fun little silly tops, but for the most part, that's not what I wear. So it's important to think about that part as well. Like not just what you want to sew, unless you're making cool wall hangings or quilts or whatever, but also what you want to wear. So I just thought that would be interesting to see. That is what I thought was going to happen, was that we were going to see a lot more people liking wearing knits, just from what I've heard, you know, in our community and everything too. But yeah, so it's important to think about what you want to wear as well when you're trying to decide what to sew and what to buy. All right, let's get back into here. Okay. So choosing the right fabric for your project. If you can't see the text, you can move my little window over to the side or up. So like I said before, the first thing you want to think about is whether it calls for a knit or a woven. These are all calder pants in this, and they're all very different fabrics. So Ayala in the full length pair is wearing a textured poly crepe. That is a really interesting fabric. It's got a sort of a bubble knit or a bubble texture to it. It's not a knit, sorry, it's a woven. And then Jenny is wearing a silk twill, which is it's sort of a mid-weight silk, and it's a twill weave. So that's not one that we talked about. It's a little bit different. Twill weave has diagonal threads as well. So instead of the just sort of regular warp and weft, it has a diagonal, which can give it a little bit more stretch, and also make it a little harder to sew, frankly. And then Andrea here in the navy is actually in a stretch suiting. So this is a wool poly blend suiting that has a little bit of spandex in it. So it has a little bit of stretch. Now that's certainly not necessary for the Calders because they have the elastic back and they have the wide legs, but it can be nice and it's quite comfortable, doesn't wrinkle, great for office wear or everyday wear for sure. So knit or woven is the basic, right? Listen to your pattern. If it says go for a knit, go for a knit. If it says go for a woven, go for a woven. Bearing in mind that if you've made it a ton of times and you know you want to make it in a different thing, you can try it. The weight, like we talked about, these three pants are all very different weights. So Andrea's is the heaviest, the navy. You can see it's got a little bit more structure to the leg. Ayala in the orange is the mid-weight. It's got more drape, but not a ton. And then Jenny in the are those leopards? Yeah, leopards is the lightest. It's the drapiest. So it gives different looks. These pants also look cool in like a linen, and depending on the type of linen you buy, it can be more structured or not. Then you think about the stretch. Does it need it or not? Some patterns absolutely require it. Like if you tried to make the Turner dress and didn't have stretch, you wouldn't be able to get it over your bust, most likely, if you made the right size. So you might need to size. You would definitely need to make sure you have the right amount of stretch for your project. And like I said, the hand or the drape, what do you want it to look like, right? It's up to you. You get to make it. So you can think like, do I want a structured look? Then I want something with a more structured drape. Do I want a super flowy look? Then you want something with more of a flowy drape. And then this is super important. When you're making a test garment, especially if it's something that you haven't made before and you're not sure how the fit's gonna work, you really need to choose your fabric. As much as we would all like to use just the cheapest muslin we can, you really want your fabric that you make your muslin out of to match the fabric that you're gonna make your final garment out of. Now, if you're making a knit garment, you have to make a knit muslin. You can't use a non-stretch woven for your muslin. It's a bummer sometimes, but you really want to try to find something that matches not only the stretch, but also the drape. So if I was going to make a shirt and I knew I was going to use a rayon, I'm not going to use like a thicker muslin to make my muslin, a thicker muslin fabric. Sorry, it's confusing because they're the same word. I'm not going to use a thicker cotton fabric to make my test garment because I'm not going to know what it's going to look like. And I might make fitting changes that don't apply, right? So you want to, when you're making your test garment, try to match as close as you can, both the drape and the stretch. This is especially true when you're making jeans. I'm not really going to get into denim too much today. That could be like a whole different webinar, but it makes a big difference when you're making jeans, the quality of the denim that you use. So if you make a muslin in just like a cheapo stretch denim that's super thin or doesn't have great recovery, you're gonna be fitting those things like crazy. And then if you make them in a nice denim, all of a sudden they fit totally different and you didn't need to make all those changes. So it's something to think about when you're making a test garment, is making sure you have the right fabric that matches your finished fabric as closely as possible. All right, so let's look a little bit more at the same pattern in different fabrics. So we already talked about these Calders, but really these patterns can be totally different depending on what you make them in. So these are all Concord t-shirts. Jenny in the middle here is in the Concord t-shirt dress hack that we have a tutorial for on the blog. But on the left, Cyrita is in an art gallery knit, which is a really nice everyday kind of knit. And they've got lots of fun prints and stripes. And that's a mid-weight cotton knit, pretty straightforward t-shirt material. Jenny in the middle is in a sweater knit. So it's much thicker. It's double-sided, super cozy, great for Boston winters and fall. And then on the right, Laura is in a bamboo knit. So you can see it's a little shinier, it's a little drapier, it's a little bit fancier, maybe, depending on how you style it, but it's also a little less forgiving, right? You can see all sorts of bumps and lumps through bamboo knit than you wouldn't be able to see through more of a beefy cotton knit. So these are things to think about when you're picking your fabric. Like, do you want more of like a shiny, fancy t-shirt? Then bamboo is going to be a great option, a bamboo rayon. That's one of my favorite things to make t-shirts out of, just because it holds up really well. It doesn't pill very much. Sometimes cottons can pill quite a bit when you wash them. And then this sweater knit that Jenny's in, oh my gosh, that just looks like the coziest thing. I would like to be wearing that right now because it's still quite chilly here. And then here's the Upton dress. So I love seeing all the different Uptons, and you all have made so many amazing ones. I just picked ones from our side just because I know exactly what they're made out of. But go on the hashtag, the Upton dress hashtag sometime, and just check out all the different Uptons, because you guys have made them in the most amazing fabrics, and they look so different depending on what you make them in. So on the far left, Jenny here is in a cotton sateen, and it's got a little bit of stretch to it. So this is like a kind of a structured but comfortable because it's got a little stretch. And this is actually the princess seam version that we have a tutorial for on the blog. But you can see it's like a nice fancy day dress. You could dress it up certainly for an evening dress too. And then Molly here in the middle is actually wearing the same rayon that I'm wearing now. So this is actually an old kit that we had found when we went to the craziest fabric place I've ever been, which was Rag Finders in LA, which is it's called a jobber. So they get dead stock fabrics, offcuts from designers overseas, extra fabric that doesn't get used. And they have this huge warehouse. I think it's like 4 stories high, and every floor is like the size of a city block, and the fabric is stacked twice, maybe 10 feet high. If you look on our blog, the Fabric Shopping in LA guide, we have some pictures of the first time we went to Rag Finders. It was crazy. But anyway, sometimes you find cool stuff. So this was a kit from that. But you can see on Molly, it's very drapey. It's a much less formal look than sort of a structured cotton. Even though it's maybe you would think rayon would be a fancier fabric, but it's nice and drapey. And then over here in this 3 people picture, we've got the black one is an ottoman fabric. So it's a textured, typically suiting, but we used it for the dress here with a little bit of stretch. And then the gold one is almost like an upholstery weight fabric, but not quite. It's like a thick woven. Those threads going horizontally are actually quite thick woven into the fabric. So that gives a really interesting textural vibe, but obviously very dressy because it's shiny and gold. And then Jenny's actually wearing one in double gauze. So double gauze is 2 layers of super thin cotton gauze fabric that are linked together with little thread loops inside the construction of the fabric. And what Jenny's wearing is a Nani Iro, which is a Japanese designer that we love the prints of. But you can see it's more of a day dress vibe. Cotton gauze, double gauze, when you wear it, gets kind of scrunchy and soft, and it's very cozy to wear. But if you like crisp seams and nicely pressed garments, steer clear. You won't be happy for sure. Let's see. All right, so let's stop the share on that one. And do we have any questions right now, Jenny?
Sorry, my internet connection is quite rubbish. Did you just ask me something, Carrie?
Oh, sorry. I was just asking if we have any questions.
Yes. Catherine asked if you can talk a bit about stretch wovens, especially when you're thinking about pants.
Sure. So stretch wovens, basically, like I was saying, you know, you have your warp and your weft. And with a stretch woven, at least a certain percentage of either the threads going this way or the threads going this way are spandex. And basically what that does is it allows, instead of just mechanical stretch, right, like we were looking at before, where you can just pull the fabric a little bit and get a little stretch, it has much more give than that. And that's a great option for a lot of pants, especially something with like less than 2% spandex. More than 2% and you're going to start getting into too much stretch where it's going to affect the fit quite a bit. But if you're less than 2% spandex, basically what you're going to get is something that has a little bit of give. Again, you want to check the recovery, because just like with knits, a stretch woven can stretch but not bounce back. And if it doesn't bounce back, you're going to need to adjust the fit a little bit more. You might need to size down a little bit in pants. But I personally love to use a stretch woven in pants. But yeah, again, when you're muslining, you want to muslin in a stretch woven if that's what you're going to sew with, because it does affect the fit a little bit. Any other questions, Jenny?
Yeah, I would say as well that, like, if you're making something that has like not very much ease at all, and that's something that, you know, you maybe aren't so comfortable with, it's a great option to just like make you feel more comfortable in the garment. So like on the Upton, you know, that Carrie just showed you, you know, that's a close fitting garment, but if you make the bodice in stretch woven, you might feel actually a little bit more comfortable if you're not used to like something that's like very fitted. All right, no more questions for now, Carrie.
Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about shopping online. Now, fabric shopping online is sometimes sort of a necessary evil, but it can also be really pretty amazing. The fabric shops, the online fabric shops have become better and better over the years. I mean, like Emma One Sock is one of our longtime favorites. Blackbird is amazing. Stone Mountain and Daughter. I mean, they just have incredible selection. And you just need to sort of develop some literacy around the way that they're describing fabrics. And some of it's trial and error, frankly. Like I remember one of the first times I ordered rayon fabric online. I got it from fabric.com and I was so excited because I found like $6 a yard rayon. I was like, wow, this is great. And I got it and it was so thin and it was so finicky because it just had no structure, and it fell apart in like 3 wears. So sometimes you get what you pay for, sometimes you get lucky, but learning to read fabric listings is really important when you're shopping online. And order swatches if you can. Sometimes it's a bummer because especially if it's like a designer dead stock fabric, like with Blackbird fabrics, they'll have these fabric drops that sell out in a day, and it's like, well, you can't really get a swatch of that. It's going to be gone before you can order the swatch even. So sometimes swatching isn't really an option, but a lot of places you can get swatches from. Like Emma One Sock is one of the best for swatching. They'll send you 5 swatches for free. They are tiny though, so it's not something that you could use to really test like the washing or anything like that, but it'll give you an idea of the structure of the fabric, how it's constructed, and the color especially. Because our screens are all different, color is really tricky online as well. Sometimes they'll reference Pantone colors, but I don't have a Pantone color card kit, so it's sort of like learning what your screen does to colors can help. I know that for me, my screen makes reds look less red, and so sometimes it's a bit of a learning curve, right? You order what you think is going to be sort of like a nice muted red, and it comes and it's like fire engine, which luckily for me, I love wearing red, so it's not a problem. But get to know sort of the quirks of online shopping for fabric. especially right now where a lot of us can't go to in-person fabric stores. And then for a lot of us, I mean, I know in Boston in the last like 5 years, almost all of our fabric shops have shut down, which is really unfortunate because shopping for fabric in person is such a treat, especially if you're looking for something really particular in the weight and the hand and the color. So, like I was talking about before, weight can be described in a couple of different ways. Sometimes they'll just say bottom weight, mid weight, blouse weight, lightweight, very lightweight. It's like, thanks, what does that mean? But sometimes they'll give you grams per square meter or ounces per square yard. I have to admit, I'm not the best with those. I usually look at sort of the general, like I'll usually either translate it into ounces just because I know that a little bit better, or there's like calculators online, you can do that, or just kind of try to read the rest of the listing to understand. But for me personally, I know like 3 to 5 ounces per square yard is great for like a drapey or a unstructured blouse. 5 to 6 ounces is great for like a structured blouse or like the Calder pants. Above that starts to get a little bit heavy for my personal taste. And then for like bottom weights, I like 9 to 11 ounce fabrics. But again, it's kind of personal preference mixed with what pattern you're using, mixed with the other elements of the fabric. So look for the weight. Like Jenny was saying, a lot of places now are doing a much better job of telling you what kind of patterns they think it would work well for. And that's a great place to start with sort of buying fabric online. Because if you know a specific pattern that you want to use and you're trying to find fabric for that, sometimes shops will have it listed. Other times you can go to the designer's blog. I know for us, like we always post recommended fabrics when we launch a pattern, and a lot of times we'll have kits too. So for us, that was really important to offer because it gives the consumer a fabric that we already know is going to work great for the project. So with kits, we always test the fabric first to make sure it actually works for what we think it's going to work for. And so that's a good place to start if you're like totally overwhelmed by trying to buy fabric online, which is understandable. It's overwhelming at times. So kits are a great place to start, or on the blog, you can get links to lots of different fabrics that we think will work well. And a lot of other designers do that as well. Stretch percentage, like I said, that is so important, especially for things like the Concord or the Ipswich. So if you're making the swimsuit, you really need really stretchy swim fabric. And you would think that all swim fabric would be really stretchy, but sometimes it's not. So stretch percentage is important to look for, and also opacity, like I was talking about before. You can have similar weight fabrics with very different levels of opacity. And if you don't want to have to line something, or you don't want to have to wear a camisole or a slip underneath, then you want to make sure that it's not transparent, that it is opaque, at least opaque enough for your comfort level. And some places have started offering matching thread, which especially right now in this time of not being able to just pop out to the store and buy a spool of thread is really helpful, especially if you're buying something that's kind of a different color. It can be really nice. I bought some fabric recently from Blackbird that was like a poppy red, and I knew I had like a true red thread, but that was it. So I got some of the thread to go with it, and it just makes it a little bit easier than trying to source thread. But if you aren't able to do that, sometimes you can email the fabric store, especially if it's an independent store, and ask for recommended thread matches. That's a great way to do it too, because oftentimes they'll have a much greater selection than you would have in your own house. And they can usually give you the actual thread number that you can then go and find online if they don't offer it. So that's definitely makes things a little bit easier. And then some of our favorite fabrics and also kind of places to go for them. So Well, this is the art gallery rayon. No, sorry, not the art gallery. This is the Rifle Paper Company rayon. This is now produced, or it's produced by Cotton and Steel. Rayon is one of my absolute favorite fabrics to sew and wear, but it can be, if you get a lightweight rayon, it can be an absolute nightmare to cut and sew and not have warp. I have definitely had fabrics go into the bin, or projects go into the bin that I worked really hard on in rayon that was not easy to work with. This is so easy to work with. It washes really well. I wash it in the machine and then I lay it flat to dry or hang it on a clothesline. And it creases like crazy, but it presses really nicely and it has enough body to it. It's thick enough fabric that it cuts and sews pretty easily, which makes a really big difference. And then I'm going to stop the share so you can see these a little bit better. And then one of our favorite Pontes is this St. John Ponte. We use this for all sorts of stuff. We use it for Concord t-shirts. We use it for Turner dresses. It makes a really nice Pembroke, great Tobin. I mean, basically all of our knit patterns besides the wrap dress and the Alcott probably would be the new sort of surplice bodice one. This might be a little too heavy for that, but Ponte is an interesting fabric that has, at least most of the time, it's double layered, where it has two sort of layers of fabric knitted together. And so because of that, it's completely opaque. You can't see through it at all. It's got great recovery, great stretch, and it's just like this classic stripe that is goes with everything. So this is one that we really love, and you can usually find it on like fabric.com or sometimes Blackbird has it, other places, but if you just look for St. John Ponte, oh, Emma One Sock often has it. This is a great fabric we use all the time. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then designer dead stock, like this fabric, this rayon that I'm wearing right now, and actually what Jenny's wearing as well is another designer dead stock. It's just fabric that's left over from production. So it's also a nice eco-friendly option because you're not buying things that are being produced new. So if you're trying to be mindful of the sustainability of your fabric, designer dead stock is a really nice option. Emma One Sock is like the queen of designer dead stock. They have such amazing fabrics and great service with swatching and everything too. Blackbird's been doing a lot more designer dead stock. I recently discovered that Stone Mountain and Daughter has a bunch. I actually found some from a brand that I really like that had like leftover silk crepe de chine, which is, it's always so fun to find like really unique fabrics that are designer dead stocks. So those are some of our favorites and a couple of tips and tricks for shopping online. Any questions about that stuff?
Not so much questions, but a couple of recommendations. So there are a couple of books that are all about fabric that actually have swatches in them. So Nadine was recommending one called Fashion for Fashion, the swatch book by Hallett and Johnston that has little samples in it. So for instance, you could compare like silk organza and poly organza. And Lynn said that Sandra Betsina also has a fabric savvy book. It doesn't have swatches, but it has lots of information about different types of fabric, different pressify, and so on.
Nice. Those are great tips. Yeah, that would be super useful.
Rose wants to know, are the fabric weights you see online useful guidelines, or do they vary too much?
With the fabric weights, do you mean like where they're saying mid-weight, bottom weight, lightweight? Yeah. Okay. Those can be helpful. I would say they do vary. I think that they are a lot of times the impression of the store owner. Like, I think this is a mid-weight. So I would say they're useful to narrow things down, but I wouldn't use just that as your guideline for the weight of the fabric. Try to sort of supplement that with the other information in the listing. And again, especially if it's an independent fabric store, email them and ask them. They'll be happy to help.
Yeah. So Rose is clarifying that she means like when you see like a grams per square meter or equivalent. So I mean, yeah, I would say like it's helpful because that's the weight of the fabric, but you need to personally be familiar with them to know what that means, right? Otherwise it's like an abstract, it's an abstract number.
Right.
So it's like helpful in one sense if you know what they're like, but it isn't helpful obviously if you don't.
Yeah.
Andrea has an interesting question. What should I be noticing in fabric pictures online when they show the swirled fabric? Is this helpful as a visual?
I personally think it's super helpful because, okay, so if you look at, let's use this rayon as an example, because this also comes in a quilting cotton, the same print. So if you look at it just flat, you basically can't tell the difference, right, between a rayon and a quilting cotton in a flat still photo. But if you look at it twisted up, it's kind of hard to do live or on the side, but you can see a lot more of how the fabric is behaving. So this twisted up, let's just use it draped as a cheat. You can see it falls really softly in these folds, and you'd see those soft folds in the twisted fabric photo as well, versus something like the chambray, whoop, that's big, where if you see it twisted, it's gonna be much more structured, big folds. Does that make sense? So you can see a lot of the behavior of the fabric in those. And sometimes you can actually see the opacity too. So sometimes I'll think something's totally opaque when it's laid flat over a solid background, and then it gets twisted. And when it's in the twisted photo, all of a sudden you can see the other twists through the fabric. And it's like, oh, not opaque. So that's kind of the things that I look for in those.
So Mary has a question. What would you call the kind of knit fabric that office cardigans are made from? The kind of thing that you'd see at J. Crew or Land's End?
So that's a lightweight sweater knit. That is one of the hardest types of fabrics to find that's a decent quality.
My internet connection's bad.
Yeah, so that's a lightweight sweater knit. Usually it's a cotton blend or a merino wool blend. So personally, that was something that I looked for a lot when I first started sewing, because I used to wear those all the time. And I found that the merino fabric from We Are the Fabric Store is a great option for that. It has sort of a similar drape and it's very fine. But those fine sweater blends, especially if you're looking for cotton, are very hard to find. Let's see, any other questions? All right, I'll look through. Jenny's got some internet connection issues. Oh, a good way to figure out scale on fabrics. That's a great question. A good online fabric store is going to have pictures with a ruler. If they don't have pictures with a ruler, it's really hard to tell unless they have some other indicator of scale, like a thread spool or something like that. But yeah, hopefully, if you're looking at a print, especially, there'll be a picture with a ruler. And again, scale is kind of a personal preference. There's some people that love big scale prints and some people that love the tiny ditzy prints and everything in between. So getting to know like if you take a look in your closet at what you wear the most, what you're drawn to the most, that'll give you a good idea of kind of the scale to look at. And you can actually measure like if you love, let's say I loved the scale of these oranges, I can measure the size of these oranges and then use that as sort of my comparison point when I'm shopping, looking at other things online. Let's see. Yes, fabric draped over and around dress forms is really helpful for seeing the drape and flow. Let's see. Swirled.
Mary had the question of whether the kit fabric from the Tobin would work for the fuller. And it depends on which one. So if you bought the one that's the color blocked one with the teal at the top and the stripes, that would work. The boiled wool one, though, probably wouldn't. I mean, it
might, but you might need to size up.
Yeah. It would look more like a jacket than a cardigan.
Actually, it would work, but it would look more like a jacket, because I just remembered I made one of the earlier samples in that. Yeah. Okay, let's see. One last thing that I definitely want to talk about before we run out of time real quick is fabric care and pre-treating. So please, if there's only one thing you take away from this webinar, please pre-wash your fabric. Please. We've all had these experiences where we don't pre-wash our fabric, or I hope you haven't actually had this experience, but you don't pre-wash, you're like, oh, it's fine, I just want to use it. I don't want to take the time to wash it. And then you make a garment that you love, and then you wash your garment, and then it becomes a doll-sized garment. So pre-wash your fabric for sure, but be sure to check the washing instructions. Basically what I do to almost every fabric that I get is I pre-wash, gentle, cold, and lay flat to dry. That's just my default. I do it to silks too, because actually if you wash a silk before you use it, you can wash it forever. You don't have to dry clean it. The only things that I dry clean are my wool coats that I've made, and those I actually pre-dry cleaned the fabric as well, because wool can shrink quite a bit. But pre-wash the way you plan to treat your garment. So if you are going to throw everything in the dryer, then you got to test that fabric in the dryer before you use it. Like we talked about earlier, if you're not sure, if you're veering off of the recommended washing instructions, cut a decent size swatch, maybe like 10-inch by 10-inch swatch, and either serge or pink the edges with pinking shears so it doesn't fray too much, and toss that in the wash, and do whatever you think you're going to do, what you want to do to the final garment. But definitely pre-wash. Things can change, not only the shrinkage, but they can change drape. Sometimes if you get a fabric that didn't have the dye set very well, the color can change, it can crease in weird ways. So pre-washing is, even though it's kind of a pain, especially if you don't have a washing machine at home, it really makes a difference. It's definitely one of the best ways to make sure that your fabric is going to behave the way you want it to, and that your garment's going to last. And yeah, for fabric care, I just don't throw any of my handmaids in the dryer. Even knits, even if they can go in the dryer, the heat of the dryer degrades spandex. So if you have a nice knit t-shirt that you've made and you love the fabric and you love the fit, if you put it in the dryer over and over again, it's going to slowly lose its elasticity. So a good rule of thumb for handmaids, for me at least, is to not put anything in the dryer. Any questions to wrap up before we have to go?
Katherine's asking whether you can machine dry linen.
I think you can. I personally don't, because my dryer ties things into knots and makes things terribly crinkly, because it's a very old dryer that doesn't work very well. So I don't know. I mean, it's one of those your mileage may vary kind of situations. Check if you don't have the washing recommendations from when you bought the fabric, a safe bet is machine wash, gentle, lay flat to dry.
And then Mary mentioned that for wool garments, soak wash, which is the name.
Yes. Yes, that's a great option for wools that can be washed, washable wools. So wools that can't be washed will felt, and that's probably not what you want. But I'm a big knitter too, so I always have soak on hand. And soak is a really nice detergent. It's a very gentle detergent that doesn't need to be rinsed out. So you basically just fill a tub with water, put a little of the soak wash in, and you squish your wool fabric or your hand knits or whatever down into it and let it soak, thus the name, for about half an hour, and then take it out and gently squeeze it out. Don't wring it, it'll felt the wool. Just gently squeeze it out and then again lay flat to dry.
Great. All right.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming and listening to me. I know I'm not Jenny, but I hope that you got some good stuff out of it. And let us know if you have any other questions. We'll post the video on YouTube, so you can always ask questions there or on the Facebook group as well. And thanks so much.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.